Charles Oliveira versus Dustin Poirier is one of the most prestigious fights of the year. The two top-ranked lightweights going at it after building themselves through the trenches of the UFC. Both fighters have been up and down. They've suffered horrendous losses only to turn their careers around and accumulate wins even against some of the best fighters in the UFC. And while they were in the abyss, they molded themselves to be extremely well-rounded fighters. Both are technical boxers, tactical kickers, strong opportunistic wrestlers, and deadly with their submissions. They represent what an MMA fighter should look like in modern times. But even though the fight should be relatively close, it should be somewhat competitive, it's actually the champion in the fight that's the underdog, and the one that most people are looking over, and it is quite understandable, because a lot of the casual fans, they know about Dustin Poirier for beating Conor McGregor twice, so of course they're going to ride on him, but it's the hardcore fans that understand how good Charles Oliveira is, and how he could potentially shatter the expectations of most fans. But how can he exactly do that in this fight? Well, Charles Oliveira, as we all know, is the most phenomenal Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu artist in this lightweight division. Nobody really wants to go to the ground with this guy, especially Dustin Poirier. So Poirier is going to try to stay on the feet as long as possible unless he hurts Charles Oliveira, drops him, gets on top of him, and tries to finish off with ground and pound. That's the only scenario of the fight where Dustin Poirier will chase the fight to the ground. He most likely is not going to shoot a takedown. If he does, he's going to get his neck wrapped up with a quickness. So ultimately, he's going to try to keep the fight standing and try to box with Oliveira, specifically get in his face, get in that short range to unload with his combinations and overwhelm his opponent. Very similar to what he did against Eddie Alvarez, against Anthony Pettis, even somewhat against Conor McGregor before Conor clinched up with Poirier. His output in close range is one of the most overwhelming things I've ever seen in MMA. He's like putting Max Holloway type of volume on you, but every shot can knock you out. Imagine every punch Max Holloway throws at these guys can knock them out senseless. That's what Dustin Poirier is doing. So close range is where Charles Oliveira doesn't necessarily want the fight. Every other scenario favors Oliveira. Mid-range, long range, on the ground, in the clinch, these all favor Charles Oliveira because one of Oliveira's biggest assets in a fight are his height and reach. He is one of the longest and tallest guys in the lightweight division, and these attributes get put behind his jabs, his front kicks, his low kicks, and his ability to pull back away from you and land the check left hook, ultimately making Charles Oliveira a dangerous sniper and forces his opponents to try to close that distance on him. And that's exactly what Dustin Poirier is going to try to do. Now we have to acknowledge Charles Oliveira's biggest weakness. He doesn't move his head off the center line. He moves his feet, but he does keep his head up high. And number two, doesn't have the greatest chin. Those two weaknesses will always give a power puncher a chance against him. And what is Dustin Poirier's main technique? The shift combo. Throws out the left straight from southpaw, switches stances with it to cover a lot of distance forward. Oliveira is not going to be quick enough to move away from this combo. And then Dustin Poirier comes over the top of the right overhand. If all things align correctly, Oliveira does not move his head away from that right overhand and could potentially get caught clean by it. Not only that, Dustin can throw left straights from a distance and potentially catch Oliveira like that as well. Any kind of these shots have the potential to hurt Oliveira. And if Oliveira is hurt, Dustin is going to drop the bombs on him, barrage him in close range, and attempt to completely eviscerate him. Any opportunity Dustin has to hurt Oliveira, he's going to take it. Because out of everybody Dustin has fought recently, Oliveira is the least durable. But when we talk about technique in almost every other scenario, Charles Oliveira has more of an advantage in this fight. Now, fights to look at for both fighters to really understand the best case scenarios that they could put themselves in here, looking at Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker, because Hooker, yes, he's a little bit taller and longer than Charles Oliveira. It's not much of a difference. He's only 1 inch taller with a 2-inch reach advantage. And Dan Hooker is also an orthodox fighter, similar to Oliveira, who attacks with jabs, who attacks with front kicks and low kicks. He's the most similar opponent Dustin Poirier has ever fought. For Charles Oliveira, he kind of fights everybody similarly, but a good southpaw to look at that he faced was David Tamer, who was attempting to land a left hand from a distance. He was trying to take the outside foot to throw it, very similar to what Dustin Poirier was doing against Dan Hooker. And David Tamer is around the same size as Dustin Poirier, who wasn't trying to go to the ground. He was mostly trying to get inside of Oliveira and box with him. That's a similar kind of game plan that Dustin Poirier is going to have as well. So those are two great fights to look at in preparation for this one. But the thing about Dustin Poirier is, he fights an orthodox fighter different than he fights a southpaw fighter. The Conor McGregor fights aren't the greatest to look at to see how Dustin Poirier would fight someone like Oliveira, because yes, they're both longer than Poirier, so there is one comparison you can make. You could see Dustin Poirier is always trying to find his way inside of that range, but when he's fighting orthodox fighters, he's a lot more patient to explode on his opening. For an example, two things he continuously goes for against orthodox fighters are: number one, he attacks the body with his kicks. Because they're both in opposite stances, it opens up the body shot for the power kick of each fighter. This is of course going to favor Charles Oliveira in this kind of match because he's a much better kicker than Poirier, like way better kicker than Poirier, faster, more powerful, more dexterity, and much more flexibility. But Poirier likes to attack that opening with a front kick or a left round kick, and he's not only trying to cause some damage doing this. Remember, Dustin Poirier's game plan is to get inside of the reach so he can implement his close range boxing volume. So by throwing the kick, he usually shifts with it, so he throws it and uses that kick as a big step forward to get inside of the reach of his longer orthodox opponent. Because when he's throwing these kind of kicks, what do opponents do? They try to grab them, they try to parry them, they try to block them, and while they're doing that, they're planting himself in space, allowing Poirier to advance on them so he can go and throw out some big right overhand because he's shifting it to the orthodox stance. This moment right here is very important for later when we talk about that shift combination against an orthodox fighter compared to a southpaw fighter. Look how Dan Hooker was able to block the punch. That's something southpaws cannot really do. But another thing that Dustin Poirier does against orthodox fighters, he likes to hand fight with the opponent because they're in opposite stances, so the lead hands are going to be right next to each other. That gives both fighters the opportunity to hand fight and hand trap. Dustin Poirier hand traps in order to find an opening for a winging left straight. He usually doesn't set up behind a jab or anything like that. He just throws it from a distance. And that ultimately can set up that signature shift combination that Poirier is known for. It's one of the best things he goes for against any style of opponent. He did it against Khabib, he did it against Max Holloway, he did it against Conor McGregor, against Dan Hooker. It doesn't matter the shape, the size, or style. Dustin Poirier is going to switch stances forward, throwing some straight punch into your face in order to find that big looping overhand to connect. But the thing about this is, it doesn't work that well against longer orthodox fighters. Against fighters who have a similar or shorter reach, it's going to work against them because they can't really pulse on him or jab him to lengthen the distance, causing the overhand to miss. That's why Max Holloway got caught for it. He has a shorter reach than Dustin. That's why Khabib got caught by it, because he has the same reach as Dustin. But against Conor and against Dan Hooker, even when Conor switched into orthodox, this shift combination did not work. Because Dustin Poirier is a southpaw fighter who throws his left hand first in order to shift with it. That creates a bit of a distraction in front of the opponent. It also allows him to measure his next punch and chase down the opponent if they want to get away from him. That right overhand at the end is the punch he's looking for to end the combination. So by simply jabbing at him or posting at him with your lead hand, it's going to create that straight punch versus looping punch scenario. And your lead arm, your lead shoulder is going to be able to block the punch. Conor was able to do this, even though he's not an experienced orthodox fighter, and Dan Hooker was able to do the same. Charles Oliveira can absolutely replicate this, as he's a very jab-heavy fighter. And that jab is also going to be able to disrupt his movement midway through. Dan Hooker showed the same exact thing to happen multiple times against Dustin Poirier. When Dustin Poirier was looking to shift forward, Dan Hooker would simply just throw a jab in his face and completely halt his movement. Another thing that makes this a lot easier for Charles Oliveira is simply hand trapping. By trapping Dustin's lead hand, it makes a shift combo much easier to see coming. This eliminates Dustin's lead hand and ultimately will make Charles Oliveira focus only on the left. Either if Dustin Poirier is going to try to throw out that left hand from a distance like he did against Dan Hooker and try to just cause damage, or shift forward for the distraction of the left so he can set up that right overhand in the shift combo. It really doesn't matter. Oliveira is going to be able to see both of these if he's trapping Dustin's lead hand. And against southpaws, it is something that Oliveira normally does against them. He loves to trap their lead hand, and against Oliveira specifically, there is another hurdle for Dustin Poirier's shift combo that he has to be worried about. Charles Oliveira's counter double leg takedown. It's something he does against a lot of fighters, man. When a southpaw throws out that left hand, he is lightning quick to duck under the punch and get that double leg takedown on them. And actually, this exact same thing happened to Dustin when he fought Dan Hooker. And I argue Hooker is not the kind of wrestler that Oliveira is. He's not as fast with the takedowns, he's not as powerful with them, and ultimately his takedowns are a lot more obvious than Oliveira's are. This means whenever Dustin throws out that left hand, or the shift combo, because usually Dustin likes to throw overhands with them, it leaves a huge low opening for Oliveira to attack the legs and hips with the takedown. And on the ground is the last place Dustin Poirier wants to be, so that makes that shift combo extremely dangerous for Dustin Poirier if he doesn't use it correctly. If he gets taken down one time, this fight could be over. It doesn't matter if it happens in the first, second, third, fourth, or fifth round. If Oliveira takes Poirier to the ground, the fight can be wraps from there. Because Dustin Poirier doesn't have the greatest submission defense, especially with chokes. We saw that against Khabib. He will give up his neck under pressure, and there's nobody who has the kind of chokes that Oliveira has in that lightweight division. Give up your neck at a split second, and Charles Oliveira turns into a boa constrictor. And the other thing is, Dustin Poirier doesn't have the greatest takedown defense in general. And number two, he doesn't really move his feet that much. He doesn't move around the cage too much. So even in open space, there is a high probability that Oliveira can just simply shoot by just throwing out maybe a jab forward create a bit of a distraction up top, shoot an under for the double leg takedown, and get the fight to the ground. The benefit with Charles Oliveira shooting takedowns like that is that he doesn't even have to get Dustin Poirier's back on the mat. If he just simply breaks down the balance of Poirier, just getting one knee to the ground, that's a victory for Charles Oliveira. He doesn't need Dustin on his back. As long as Dustin even gets on one knee, that's enough for Oliveira to capitalize. Now, regarding Oliveira's offensive weapons, he goes to many different kind of things, but the jab, front kick, low kicks are generally the main attacks he goes to in a fight. All similar weapons that Dan Hooker used against Poirier, so we can see from a slower, slightly longer fighter in Dan Hooker, how do they work against Dustin? When jabs come at Dustin, he likes to pull away from them. He likes to lean back away, which is not the kind of reaction that's going to benefit Dustin. Because what happens here is, by throwing out a jab and Dustin leaning back, he's ultimately giving his hips to the opponent. He's putting his weight on the back foot, ultimately being vulnerable to a takedown, and potentially even a right straight if, let's say, Charles Oliveira after that jab wants to continue that combination. You never want to pull away in a straight line away from a longer fighter's jab because you're only putting yourself in range of the right hand, and that was something he was continuously doing against Dan Hooker, but Hooker never really followed up on that. But where the jab was being successful for Hooker, the leg kicks and body kicks were ultimately getting defended by Poirier. Poirier was doing a very good job of attempting to parry the front kick as well as moving away from it. If he can get a grip with that parry, he's of course going to use that to enter distance. He's going to pick it up and march you down. And most of the leg kicks, especially because they're in opposite stances, were getting checked. Dustin Poirier checked almost every single leg kick from Dan Hooker, but the issue was he was still getting damaged by this. There would be multiple times where Dan Hooker would kick Dustin's shin and Dustin's leg would just go flying backwards. It was looking like it was hurting Dustin more than was hurting Dan Hooker. Now back then, Poirier's shins might not have been that conditioned, which was causing this kind of damage. If they're still not conditioned today, Charles Oliveira is going to be able to kick the shins and win on the damage. But we have to know, Dustin fought Conor McGregor and went to a leg kicking heavy game plan, which means he must have conditioned his shins a lot more for those Conor McGregor fights. But we do know he will check inside leg kicks. Oliveira's a lot faster than Dan Hooker, but I still see him checking Oliveira's kicks. But one interesting thing that happened here, because Dan Hooker did land the leg kick, was that it causes Dustin to plant himself after the leg kick, and this gave Dan Hooker the green light to land a jab immediately afterward. So when you really start to think about it, there's a lot of openings for Charles Oliveira. Like, there's so many, I think it goes over a lot of people's heads when they think about this fight. Almost all of Dustin's offense comes with risk in this fight with Oliveira. He can get taken to the ground if Oliveira is able to time the left hand or the shift combination. He can intercept it with a jab. He could potentially intercept it with a front kick. He can kick out the leg while Dustin's throwing it out there. And if Dustin's sitting at a distance because he doesn't have that kind of footwork to get inside of Oliveira's reach from a distance like that without using takedowns, Oliveira can simply just front kick him, leg kick him, and jab him from a distance the entire time. Oliveira is also excellent at blocking any kind of kick that comes his way. So anything that really Dustin throws out there with kicks can ultimately be countered and blocked by Oliveira. The only thing that Oliveira is going to have a hard time with is, number one, he does not time that shift combo and gets hit at a distance because of it. And number two, Dustin Poirier gets in close and barrages him. Those are the two scenarios that Dustin has in the fight. Everything else favors Charles Oliveira. And that's ultimately the end of the breakdown, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and if you did, make sure to give this a thumbs up. If you enjoyed my content, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the predictions for tomorrow.